April 29, 1945. The small Bavarian town of Miesbach lay nestled in the Alpine foothills, its church spires and timbered buildings standing in stark contrast to the chaos engulfing the rest of Germany. As dawn broke, Frau Helga Müller hurriedly gathered her 2 young daughters, certain that the Americans would arrive by nightfall, and equally certain that the stories about their savagery, especially the Negro soldiers, were entirely true. In just 3 days, these same frightened German civilians would be sharing their tables with those they feared most, proving how thoroughly Reich propaganda had misled them about the nature of their supposed enemies. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the 761st Tank Battalion, the first African-American armored unit to see combat in World War II, arrived in southern Bavaria and inadvertently shattered years of Nazi racial propaganda, not through force, but through simple human decency that the German civilians had been conditioned to believe impossible. The preparations began at dawn. Frau Müller, a 32-year-old widow whose husband had died on the Eastern Front 2 years prior, methodically packed a small suitcase with family photographs, some bread, a jar of preserved cherries and a change of clothes for each of her daughters, Greta, age 7, and Elsa, age 5. Her mother-in-law, Oma Müller, watched disapprovingly from her rocking chair. "Where will you go, Helga? The roads are clogged with refugees. The Americans are coming from the west, the Russians from the east. Better to stay put and face whatever comes," the older woman said, her fingers never ceasing their knitting. Helga continued packing. "You've seen the newsreels. You've heard the reports. The American soldiers are savages, especially the Negro ones. Dr. Goebbels said they were barely civilized, former criminals released from prisons and given uniforms. They will do unspeakable things, particularly to German women. We must hide in the forest until they move on." Oma Müller set down her knitting. "I lived through the Great War, child." "I've heard such tales before. Propaganda flows both ways." "This is different," Helga insisted. "The Negro soldiers are the worst, like animals, not men. The Burgermeister himself warned us yesterday. Don't let the black cowboys touch you or your children. They carry disease, they steal, they—" She lowered her voice, glancing at her daughters. "They violate women." 40 kilometers away, Staff Sergeant William Jefferson of the 761st Tank Battalion was performing maintenance on his Sherman tank, which the crew had nicknamed Brown Devil. The 761st, known as the Black Panthers, after their unit insignia, had fought their way from France through Belgium and into Germany, battling not just the enemy, but also the prejudice of their own army. Jefferson, a 24-year-old former ranch hand from Texas, had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, determined to prove that black Americans could fight just as effectively as whites. "How's she looking, Jeff?" asked Corporal Marcus Washington, the tank's gunner, as he approached with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Jefferson wiped grease from his hands. "Transmission's acting up again, but I think she'll hold. Been through worse." He accepted the coffee gratefully. "Any word on our next move?" Washington nodded. "Captain says we're pushing toward some town called Miesbach tomorrow. Part of the final push. Intelligence says resistance is crumbling, but you never know." "Heard anything from home?" Jefferson asked, knowing Washington had a wife and infant son back in Chicago. A smile spread across Washington's face. "Got a letter yesterday. Junior's starting to walk. Martha says he's into everything now." The smile faded slightly. "She also said there was trouble at the factory. Some of the white workers don't like that she got promoted to shift supervisor." Jefferson sighed. "So we fight fascism over here while dealing with the same old story back home." "That's the truth," Washington replied. "But Captain Johnson says we're making history. First black armored unit in combat. People can't ignore that forever." "Maybe," Jefferson said, though he wasn't convinced. He had encountered too much prejudice, even within the U.S. Army, to be optimistic. The 761st had been activated in 1942, but wasn't committed to combat until late 1944. They'd spent 2 years training, often in segregated facilities, while white units with less preparation were sent overseas. When they finally reached Europe, they were initially assigned to General Patton's Third Army. The general's welcoming speech had been memorable, if problematic. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army," Patton had said. "I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I don't care what color you are as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." Despite Patton's backhanded vote of confidence, the 761st had proven their worth repeatedly, fighting continuously for 183 days, longer than any other armored unit in the European theater. They had participated in the Battle of the Bulge and helped liberate several concentration camps. Their casualties had been heavy, almost 50%, but they had never faltered. Now, in the waning days of April 1945, they were part of the final push into southern Germany. The Third Reich was collapsing, but isolated pockets of resistance remained, particularly from SS units and Hitler Youth, who fought with the desperation of the doomed. 32 tanks, 676 men. The 761st had started with 36 medium tanks, 6 assault guns, and 689 men. Their losses had been significant, but their accomplishments were undeniable. Yet Jefferson wondered if any of it would matter once they returned to an America where they would still be second-class citizens. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commanding officer of the 761st, approached Jefferson and Washington. Unlike many white officers assigned to Negro units, Bates had refused a transfer to a white battalion, choosing instead to stay with the men he had trained. His loyalty had earned him the respect of his troops. "Staff Sergeant, how's the maintenance coming?" Bates asked. Jefferson straightened to attention. "Almost finished, sir. We'll be ready to roll at 0500. Bates nodded. "Good. I've just received our orders for tomorrow. We're moving toward Miesbach, about 30 miles south of Munich. Intelligence reports minimal resistance, but stay alert. The locals have been fed a steady diet of propaganda about American troops, particularly about Negro soldiers. Expect some fear, possibly hostility." "Nothing new there, sir," Washington commented. Bates gave a grim smile. "True enough, but remember, how you conduct yourselves matters. Every interaction with civilians is a chance to counter the lies they've been told. We're not just defeating the German army, we're defeating an ideology." "Yes, sir," Jefferson replied, though he was skeptical. In his experience, prejudice wasn't so easily overcome. As Bates walked away, Private First Class Leon Williams, the tank's loader, joined them. At 19, Williams was the youngest member of the crew and had joined the unit as a replacement just 3 months earlier. "What's the word, Sarge?" Williams asked. "We're heading to some town called Miesbach tomorrow," Jefferson replied. "Should be light resistance." Williams nodded, heard some of the guys talking about how the Germans are scared of us specifically, like they think we're going to eat them or something. Washington laughed. "Nazi propaganda. Been telling them for years that we're savages, half-apes, they call us." "After what we saw at that camp last week," Jefferson said, referring to a concentration camp they had helped liberate, "I'd say the Germans have the market cornered on savagery." The men fell silent, remembering the skeletal figures, the mass graves, the indescribable smell of death. It had affected them all deeply, perhaps Williams most of all. The young private had vomited repeatedly and hadn't been able to eat for 2 days afterward. "Sometimes I wonder," Williams said quietly, "if we're fighting for a country that doesn't want us, against a country that fears us to save people who don't know us." Jefferson put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "We're fighting because it's right, son. Whatever comes after, at least we'll know we stood on the right side." As evening fell, Helga Müller abandoned her plan to flee to the forest. The roads were indeed crowded with refugees, many of whom brought tales of American columns bypassing towns completely or passing through quickly. Perhaps Oma was right. Better to stay put and face whatever came. The Burgermeister, Herr Adler, had ordered all citizens to display white sheets from their windows as a sign of surrender. No resistance was to be offered. The few remaining Wehrmacht soldiers had retreated days ago, heading toward the Austrian border. Only a handful of elderly Volkssturm members remained, armed with hunting rifles and outdated World War I weapons. They too had been ordered to stand down. That evening, Helga gathered with neighbors in the town square. The atmosphere was tense, fearful. Pastor Brecht, the Lutheran minister, tried to calm the crowd. "We must remember our common humanity," he said. "The Americans are not monsters, despite what we have been told. They are men, with families and homes. If we offer no resistance, they will have no reason to harm us. What about the Negroes? Someone called out. We've heard they're animals. The pastor hesitated. I cannot speak to that. We must pray for God's protection. Herr Adler, a former party official who had hastily removed his Nazi insignia the day before, took over. We have received reports that a Negro tank unit is part of the American force approaching from the north. Special precautions are advised. Keep your women and children indoors. Avoid all contact. Do not look them in the eye. Above all, do not let them touch you or your children. Why not? Asked Frau Schmidt, the baker's wife. Disease, Adler replied confidently. And they are known to be impulsive, violent. Their jungle nature is barely contained by their uniforms. The American whites use them as shock troops because they are expendable and naturally aggressive. Helga clutched her daughters closer. The Burgermeister's words confirmed her worst fears. She resolved to barricade herself and her children in the root cellar until the danger had passed. Back at the American camp, Staff Sergeant Jefferson couldn't sleep. Tomorrow would be another push forward, perhaps one of the last of the war. Hitler was reportedly dead, a suicide in his Berlin bunker. The German army was disintegrating. Victory seemed imminent, yet Jefferson felt uneasy. He walked to the edge of the camp, gazing at the distant mountains, silver in the moonlight. The beauty of the Bavarian countryside seemed at odds with the ugliness of the war they had waged across it. Captain James Johnson, the commander of Jefferson's company and one of the few black officers in the battalion, found him there. Can't sleep. Jeff, Johnson asked, offering a cigarette. Jefferson accepted it. Just thinking, sir, about what happens after. Johnson nodded. We go home, face a different kind of battle. Do you think anything will change after what we've done here? Johnson considered the question. Something has to change. How can they ask us to fight fascism abroad and accept discrimination at home? But change won't come easy or fast. He took a drag on his cigarette. My father fought in the Great War, came home to race riots in 1919, white folks afraid of Negro soldiers who'd gotten too many ideas about equality in France. I remember my grandfather talking about that, Jefferson said. Said they called it the Red Summer. That's right. Let's hope history doesn't repeat itself. Johnson looked at the stars. You know, before the war I was studying law at Howard. I'm going back to finish. We need to fight with laws and votes just as hard as we fought with tanks and guns. Yes, sir, Jefferson replied. I'm thinking of using the GI Bill, maybe study engineering. Good man, that's how we win the long war. Johnson checked his watch. Try to get some sleep, Sergeant. Big day tomorrow. As Johnson walked away, Jefferson thought about the irony of their situation. They were liberating people who had been told they were subhuman while coming from a country that often treated them as second-class citizens. Yet here they were, representing that same country, fighting and dying under its flag. Dawn broke clear and cold on April 30th, 1945. The men of the 761st prepared their tanks, checking ammunition, fuel, and equipment with the practiced efficiency of veterans. Jefferson's crew, Washington, Williams, Private Henry Rodriguez, the driver, and Private First Class Samuel Wilson, the assistant driver bow gunner, worked silently, each man lost in his own thoughts. Think this might be one of our last actions? Rodriguez asked, as he performed his final checks on the tank's engine. Let's hope so, Washington replied. I'm ready to see Chicago again. What's the first thing you'll do when you get home, Sarge? Williams asked Jefferson. Jefferson thought for a moment. Eat my mama's fried chicken, then sleep in a real bed for about a week. He looked at the youngest member of his crew. What about you, Williams? Going to ask Betty Johnson to marry me, Williams said, a rare smile crossing his face. Been carrying this ring since Paris. He patted his breast pocket. You never mentioned a girl back home, Washington teased. Some things a man keeps private, Williams replied. Figure if I make it through this war, it's a sign we're meant to be. The order came to mount up. The column of tanks, accompanied by infantry from the 99th Infantry Division, began their advance toward Miesbach. The roads were clogged with refugees heading in the opposite direction, civilians fleeing the fighting, displaced persons liberated from camps and forced labor, former prisoners of war making their way home. The Americans passed them all. sometimes stopping to offer food or medical assistance. As they approached Miesbach, Jefferson was struck by the beauty of the town. It looked untouched by war, like something from a fairy tale with its alpine setting and Bavarian architecture. White sheets hung from many windows, signaling surrender. There was no sign of military resistance. The lead elements of the 99th Infantry entered the town first, securing key intersections and buildings. The tanks of the 761st followed, their engines breaking the eerie silence that had fallen over Miesbach. Jefferson, standing in the turret of his Sherman, noticed faces peering from windows, quickly disappearing when spotted. The Americans established their command post in the town hall. Colonel Bates called a meeting of his company commanders and senior NCOs. "Gentlemen, the situation appears secure," Bates informed them. "No enemy forces reported. The Burgermeister has officially surrendered the town. We'll be staying here for at least 48 hours, while the rest of the division catches up. Standard occupation protocols, security patrols, curfew for civilians, no fraternization." Captain Johnson raised a hand. "Sir, what about civilian needs? Food, medical?" "Good question," Bates replied. "From what we can tell, the town hasn't suffered any combat damage, but there are shortages of everything. We'll distribute some rations to the most vulnerable, children, elderly, ill. Medical team will set up in the school building. Any other questions?" "How are we handling the propaganda issue, sir?" Lieutenant Wilson asked. "These people have been fed a steady diet of lies about Americans, especially Negro troops." Bates nodded grimly. "I'm aware. The Burgermeister has been ordered to assemble the town leaders this afternoon. I'll address them directly, make our expectations clear. In the meantime, maintain professional conduct at all times. Your actions will speak louder than any propaganda." The meeting broke up, and Jefferson returned to his tank. The crew had been assigned quarters in a small hotel near the town square, but they would maintain a rotation of at least one man with the vehicle at all times. As Jefferson approached, he saw a small group of German children watching the tank from a distance, their expressions a mixture of fear and curiosity. "They act like they've never seen black folks before," Washington commented. "They probably haven't," Jefferson replied, "except in those racist propaganda films." One brave boy, about 10 years old, edged closer, staring at Jefferson with wide eyes. "Hello?" Jefferson said, using one of the few German words he knew. The boy froze, then turned and ran, shouting something to the other children. They all scattered. "What did he say?" Williams asked Rodriguez, who had picked up some German during their time in Europe. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "You don't want to know, PFC. Tell me anyway." Rodriguez sighed. He said, "Run. The Negro will eat you." Something like that. Williams shook his head in disgust. Unbelievable. In her house on Marktstrasse, Helga Müller peered through a crack in the curtains, watching as an American tank rumbled past. She gasped when she saw the black face of the soldier in the turret. Quickly, she pulled her daughters away from the window. "Remember what I told you," she whispered urgently. "Stay inside. If you see the black soldiers, do not look at them, do not speak to them, and above all, do not let them touch you." "Why, Mutti?" Greta asked. "Because they're dangerous," Helga replied. "Now help me move this cabinet in front of the door." Oma Müller watched from her chair, shaking her head. "You're frightening the children needlessly, Helga." "I'm protecting them," Helga insisted. A knock at the door startled them all. Helga froze, her face pale. "Frau Müller?" called a voice in German. "It's Herr Adler, the Burgermeister. Please open up." Cautiously, Helga moved the cabinet and opened the door. Herr Adler stood there, accompanied by a white American officer. "Frau Müller, this is Lieutenant Schmidt of the American Army," Adler said nervously. "He speaks German, they are, requisitioning rooms for their officers." The American officer gave a polite nod. "Good afternoon, ma'am. We need to billet 2 officers in homes with spare rooms. The Burgermeister suggested your house, since it's one of the larger ones in town." Helga's heart raced. "Officers? What kind of officers?" Lieutenant Schmidt looked confused. "Army officers, ma'am, 1 captain, 1 lieutenant." Are they Negro officers?" Helga asked fearfully. The American's expression hardened slightly. "Captain Johnson is a Negro, yes. Lieutenant Parker is white. They're both officers in the United States Army and will be treated with appropriate respect." Herr Adler gave Helga a warning look. The Americans have been very clear. Frau Müller, we are to cooperate fully. They have promised fair treatment if we comply with their orders. Trapped, Helga nodded stiffly. When will they arrive? Within the hour, Lieutenant Schmidt replied. They'll need 2 separate rooms. They'll provide their own rations and will respect your privacy. He paused. I assure you, ma'am, you have nothing to fear from American soldiers, regardless of their color. After they left, Helga sank into a chair close to tears. Oma Müller came to her side. It will be all right, child, the older woman said. Perhaps this is for the best. You'll see they're just men, not monsters. How can you say that? Helga demanded. You don't know what they might do. Neither do you, Oma replied calmly. All you know is what the party told you, and the party has been wrong about many things, hasn't it? Helga had no answer for that. The last few months had seen the collapse of everything she had been taught to believe. The promised final victory had turned into catastrophic defeat. The Führer, who was supposed to lead Germany to a 1,000-year Reich, was reportedly dead by his own hand. Could the party have been wrong about the Americans too? About the Negro soldiers? She rose and began preparing the 2 spare bedrooms, her movements mechanical. Whatever happened, she would protect her daughters. That much she knew. At the town hall, Colonel Bates addressed the assembled German officials and community leaders, using Lieutenant Schmidt as an interpreter. He outlined the rules of the occupation and the Americans' expectations. This is a military occupation, not a punitive expedition, Bates stated firmly. Civilians who obey the rules have nothing to fear. Curfew will be from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. No weapons are permitted. All former Nazi Party officials must report for registration. Anyone harboring SS personnel will be arrested. Pastor Brecht raised a hand. What about food, Herr Colonel? Our supplies are running low. We'll distribute emergency rations to those in need, Bates replied. Our medical personnel will also be available for civilians requiring treatment. Another man, the local doctor, spoke up hesitantly. Herr Colonel, there have been concerns about the Negro soldiers. We have heard stories. Colonel Bates's expression remained neutral, but his voice took on an edge. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion are United States soldiers. They have fought across Europe with distinction. They will behave with the same discipline and professionalism as any American troops. Any civilian spreading false rumors or inciting hostility will be arrested. The doctor persisted. But the diseases, Herr Colonel, we've been told— You've been told lies, Bates interrupted sharply. Nazi propaganda, nothing more. I suggest you concern yourself with facts rather than racist fiction, Doctor. The room fell silent. After a moment, Herr Adler spoke up, his tone conciliatory. We understand, Herr Colonel, the community will cooperate fully. As the meeting concluded, Captain Johnson approached Colonel Bates. Thank you for that, sir. Bates shook his head. Nothing to thank me for, Captain, just stating facts. He looked around at the departing Germans. They've been indoctrinated for years. It won't change overnight, but seeing is believing. Your men's conduct will do more to change minds than anything I could say. Captain Johnson nodded. I understand. Sir, I've instructed the men accordingly. Good. Now I believe you have billeting arranged. Yes, sir. Lieutenant Parker and I are staying with a family named Müller on Marktstrasse. Keep me informed of any issues, Bates said. I want this occupation to go smoothly. God knows these people have seen enough trouble. That evening, Helga Müller set an extra place at the dinner table with trembling hands. Captain Johnson had arrived an hour earlier, accompanied by Lieutenant Parker. Both officers had been unfailingly polite, speaking through Lieutenant Schmidt, who had returned to serve as an interpreter. They had deposited their gear in the assigned rooms, then left to attend to their duties, promising to return for the evening meal. Oma Müller watched her daughter-in-law's nervous preparations. You're acting as if we're about to dine with the devil himself. Helga didn't respond. She had insisted that Greta and Elsa eat earlier and remain in their bedroom during dinner. Despite the American's politeness, she wasn't taking any chances. A knock at the door announced the officer's return. Lieutenant Parker entered first, removing his cap. He was tall and fair-haired, with a boyish face that made him look younger than his 24 years. Good evening, Frau Müller, he said in halting German. Thank you for your hospitality. Captain Johnson followed. He was of medium height, powerfully built, with a serious expression that softened when he smiled in greeting. His uniform was impeccable, bearing the insignia of a captain in the United States Army. "Good evening," he said in English, which Lieutenant Parker translated. "Something smells wonderful." Helga managed a stiff nod, not meeting his eyes. "Please sit down." The meal was a tense affair at first. Helga had prepared a potato soup, meager fare given the shortages, but the best she could manage. The officers contributed canned meat and chocolate from their rations, insisting that Oma Müller and Helga share. Conversation was stilted, with Lieutenant Parker translating. They discussed neutral topics: the weather, the beauty of the Bavarian countryside, the officers' hometowns in America. Gradually, Helga found herself relaxing slightly. Captain Johnson was well-spoken, educated, not at all the savage she had been led to expect. When he mentioned that he had been a law student before the war, she couldn't hide her surprise. "You seem shocked, Frau Müller," Captain Johnson said through the interpreter. "Did you not believe Negroes could be educated?" Helga blushed. We were told different things about American Negroes." "What things?" Johnson asked. Helga looked down at her plate, embarrassed. "That you were primitive, violent, that most of you were criminals who had been given the choice of prison or the army." Captain Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I see. And now that you've met me?" Helga met his eyes for the first time. "I don't know what to think anymore. Everything we were told seems to be a lie." Oma Müller spoke up. "The biggest lie was that we were winning the war. After that, why should we believe anything they told us?" A small sound from the doorway caught their attention. Greta stood there in her nightgown, staring wide-eyed at the American officers. "Greta!" Helga exclaimed. "Go back to your room!" But the child didn't move, her gaze fixed on Captain Johnson. "Are you going to eat us?" she asked in German. Lieutenant Parker choked on his soup. Captain Johnson looked to him for translation. "She wants to know if you're going to eat them," Parker said, trying to keep a straight face. Johnson's expression flickered between shock and amusement. "No, little one," he said gently. As Parker translated, "I don't eat children. I have a daughter about your age back home. Her name is Lily." "Really?" Greta took a tentative step forward. "What does she look like?" Johnson reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph, which he placed on the table. "This is Lily with her mother, my wife Eleanor." Cautiously, Greta approached the table and looked at the photo. It showed a smiling black woman with a little girl of about 6, both dressed in their Sunday best. "She's pretty," Greta said. "She looks like you." Johnson smiled. "Thank you. I think so too." Helga watched the exchange in confusion and growing shame. This man, whom she had feared as something less than human, was showing her a picture of his family with the same pride any father would display. "Greta, it's time for bed," she said, but with less urgency than before. "Can I show the picture to Elsa first?" Greta asked. Helga hesitated, then nodded. Greta took the photograph and ran back to the bedroom she shared with her sister. "I apologize for my daughter," Helga said, "and for what I said." Captain Johnson shook his head. "No apology needed, ma'am. Propaganda is a powerful weapon. It's designed to make people fear and hate what they don't understand." "Still," Helga insisted, "I should have known better." "Perhaps," Johnson acknowledged, "but now you do." The next morning, Jefferson's crew was assigned to security patrol on the eastern edge of town. As they performed maintenance on their tank, Jefferson noticed a group of German children watching from a distance, just as they had the day before. This time, however, they seemed more curious than fearful. One boy, the same brave one from yesterday, approached cautiously. "Amerikanisch?" he asked. Jefferson nodded. "American, yes." The boy pointed at himself. "Hans." Then he pointed at Jefferson questioningly. "William," Jefferson replied. "Staff Sergeant William Jefferson." Hans considered this, then pointed at the tank. "Panzer," Jefferson smiled. "Sherman, M4 Sherman." The boy's face lit up with recognition. "Ah, Sherman." He turned and called to his friends in German. Slowly they approached as well. Washington emerged from the tank, wiping his hands on a rag. "Making friends, Jeff?" "Trying to," Jefferson replied. "These kids have probably never seen black folks before, except in propaganda films." Hans was now examining the tank with obvious interest, keeping a respectful distance, but clearly fascinated. Jefferson reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar, part of his rations. He broke off a piece and offered it to Hans. The boy hesitated, glancing at his friends. "It's okay," Jefferson said, taking a bite himself to demonstrate. "Chocolate. Good." Cautiously, Hans accepted the piece, took a tiny nibble, then broke into a smile. "Gut, danke." Jefferson broke the rest of the bar into pieces and distributed them among the children. Soon they were all chattering excitedly in German. Rodriguez, who had been working on the engine, joined them. "What are they saying?" "Something about how the Negro gives better chocolate than the white soldiers," Rodriguez translated with a grin. "Apparently you're their new best friend, Sarge." Jefferson laughed. "Amazing what a little chocolate can do." By noon, word had spread through the town's children about the friendly black soldiers who gave out chocolate. More kids appeared, hovering at a distance, until Jefferson or one of his crew beckoned them closer. Some brought small gifts in exchange: a wildflower, a carefully drawn picture, a shiny rock. Williams produced a baseball and glove from his personal gear. And soon an impromptu game was underway in a nearby field. The German children had never seen baseball before, but they caught on quickly, shouting with excitement whenever someone hit the ball. Jefferson watched from the turret of his tank, a bittersweet feeling washing over him. These children who had been taught to fear him now played and laughed as if color didn't matter. If only adults could learn so quickly. A German woman approached, watching the game with obvious anxiety. She called out to one of the boys, who reluctantly left the game and went to her side. They had a brief, intense conversation, with the boy gesturing toward Williams and the other soldiers. Finally, the woman's posture relaxed slightly. She gave a hesitant nod, and the boy raced back to rejoin the game. Jefferson caught Williams's eye and nodded approval. "Nice work, Private. Baseball diplomacy." Williams grinned. "Wait till I teach them how to swing properly. We'll have a real team by the end of the week." That afternoon, Captain Johnson called a meeting of his platoon leaders and senior NCOs, including Jefferson. "Colonel Bates has received orders," Johnson informed them. "We'll be moving out the day after tomorrow, heading toward Austria. Most of the division is pushing ahead, but we're to remain here another 48 hours to secure the town and assist with civilian needs." Lieutenant Wilson raised a hand. "Any resistance expected, sir?" "Minimal to none," Johnson replied. "The war is effectively over in this sector. Our main concerns now are maintaining order, preventing looting, and dealing with the humanitarian situation." He looked around at his men. "I've noticed increased interaction between our troops and the local population, particularly the children." Jefferson tensed, wondering if a reprimand was coming. Fraternization with the enemy population was technically forbidden. Instead, Johnson continued, "I think this is a positive development. These people have been fed lies about us for years. The best way to counter that is through direct, positive contact." He smiled slightly. "Just keep it appropriate and professional. We're still occupying soldiers, not tourists." "Sir," Jefferson spoke up, "some of the men have been sharing their rations with local kids. Is that authorized?" Johnson nodded. "Use your judgment, Sergeant. Don't give away so much that you go hungry, but if you can spare something for a hungry child, I won't stop you." He paused. "In fact, I've arranged for a special ration distribution tomorrow at the town square. Food, candy, basic medical supplies. I'd like volunteers to help." Every hand in the room went up. Johnson looked pleased. "Good. Sergeant Jefferson, your crew has seemed to make the most inroads with the local children. Would you be willing to head up the distribution?" "Yes, sir," Jefferson replied without hesitation. "Excellent. Dismissed, gentlemen." As the meeting broke up, Lieutenant Wilson approached Jefferson. "The captain seems to have a soft spot for these Germans." Jefferson shrugged. "Not so much the Germans specifically, sir, just people in general. Captain believes how we treat them now will matter for the peace later." Wilson considered this. "Maybe he's right. Still, after what we saw in those camps." "I know," Jefferson said quietly. "But most of these folks are just ordinary people caught up in something bigger than themselves. Like those kids playing baseball today, they didn't start this war. No, Wilson agreed, but their parents did. Maybe, Jefferson acknowledged, or maybe they just didn't do enough to stop it. He looked at Wilson, kind of like folks back home who don't speak up when they see colored people being mistreated. Wilson, who was from Boston, flushed slightly. Point taken, Sergeant. That evening, the officers' mess was set up in the town's main restaurant. The owner, Herr Weber, had been instructed to prepare a meal for the American officers using supplies provided by the Army. Jefferson and the other senior NCOs were invited to join them. A rare occurrence, as Negro NCOs usually ate separately from white officers, even within the 761st. As they ate, Colonel Bates addressed the group. "Gentlemen, I've received reports of your activities in town today, the baseball game, the chocolate distributions, the medical assistance." He looked around the table. "I want to commend you all. Your conduct has been exemplary." Captain Johnson spoke up. "The men deserve the credit, sir. They've shown remarkable restraint and compassion, especially considering some of the attitudes they've encountered." Bates nodded. "I'm aware. The Burgermeister informed me of some of the misconceptions the locals had about Negro troops." He shook his head in disgust. "Apparently they were told you would eat their children, among other absurdities." A murmur of disbelief ran through the Negro officers and NCOs. "That explains a lot," Jefferson said. "We've had children asking us if we're cannibals." "Which is why your positive interactions are so important," Bates continued. "You're not just representing the United States Army, you're demonstrating the fundamental falsity of Nazi racial ideology." He raised his glass. "To the men of the 761st, the best damn tankers in the European theater, regardless of color." "Here." "Here," echoed the white officers, though a few did so with less enthusiasm than others. After dinner, Jefferson stepped outside for a smoke. The night was clear, stars brilliant above the darkened town. Curfew was in effect, so the streets were deserted except for American patrols. Lieutenant Parker joined him, offering a light. "Got a minute, Sergeant?" "Of course, sir." Parker seemed uncomfortable. "I wanted to ask you something about Captain Johnson." Jefferson tensed. "What about him, sir?" "He's different from what I expected." "How so?" Parker hesitated. "I grew up in Alabama. Never knew any educated Negro men before the Army. Captain Johnson has degrees, speaks better than most white officers I know." "There are plenty of educated colored folks, sir," Jefferson replied carefully. "Just not many opportunities for them to show it." Parker nodded. "I'm realizing that. He was telling me about his plans after the war, finishing law school, maybe running for office someday." He looked at Jefferson. "You think that's possible? A Negro in Congress?" Jefferson thought of the America he had left behind, the segregation, the discrimination, the casual cruelty. "It won't be easy, but after what we've done here, how can they tell us we're not good enough to have a voice back home?" "Some will try," Parker said. "My father would be one of them." He took a deep drag on his cigarette. "Being over here, seeing what happens when hate becomes government policy, it makes a man think." "Yes, sir, it does." They smoked in silence for a moment. Then Parker spoke again. "My family has a farm, 300 acres, cotton mostly. We always had colored workers. My father called them our people, like they belong to us." He shook his head. "I can't go back to thinking that way. Not after serving with men like you and Captain Johnson." Jefferson wasn't sure how to respond. He had encountered plenty of white soldiers who espoused similar sentiments in the heat of battle or the camaraderie of shared hardship, only to revert to old prejudices once the moment passed. "That's good to hear, sir," he said finally. But talk is cheap," Parker finished for him. "I know. All I can say is, this war has changed me. I can't unsee what I've seen or unknown what I now know." He extended his hand. "For what it's worth, it's been an honor serving alongside you, Sergeant Jefferson." After a moment's surprise, Jefferson shook the offered hand. "Likewise, sir." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as preparations were made for the ration distribution. Trucks arrived from the division supply depot, bringing food, candy, toiletries, and basic medical supplies. Tables were set up in the town square, with signs in German explaining the procedure. Initially, few Germans appeared. They watched from windows and doorways, hesitant to approach the American soldiers, particularly the black ones. But hunger and need eventually overcame fear, and a line began to form, mostly women, children, and elderly men. Jefferson and his crew, along with other volunteers from the 761st, manned the distribution tables. Despite the language barrier, they managed to communicate through gestures, smiles, and the occasional translated phrase. Williams, in particular, was a hit with the children, performing simple magic tricks with chocolate bars that appeared from behind ears or inside caps. Hans, the boy from the day before, arrived with his mother, a thin woman with tired eyes. When it was their turn, Jefferson recognized them and gave Hans an extra chocolate bar with a wink. "Danke, Herr William," Hans said, proudly using Jefferson's first name. His mother looked alarmed at the familiarity, but Jefferson smiled reassuringly. "Your son is a good boy," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey the meaning. The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod of acknowledgement before hurrying away with her son. Around midday, a commotion erupted at one of the tables. An elderly German man was shouting at Private Wilson, who had been distributing canned meat. "Was ist los?" Jefferson asked, using one of the few German phrases he knew. Lieutenant Schmidt hurried over to translate. "He says the Negro tried to poison him, says the meat is tainted." Wilson looked bewildered. "I gave him the same food as everyone else." A crowd was gathering, murmurs running through the Germans. The situation was tense. Captain Johnson arrived, assessing the scene quickly. "Lieutenant, tell the gentleman that all food comes from American Army rations. The same food our soldiers eat," Schmidt translated. The old man remained unconvinced, still pointing accusingly at Wilson. Johnson made a decision. "Tell him I'll eat from the same can to prove it's safe." After Schmidt translated, Johnson opened a fresh can of the meat, took a large bite, and swallowed it demonstratively. He then offered the can back to the German. The old man looked surprised, then embarrassed. He shook his head and said something in German. "He apologizes," Schmidt translated. "Says he was mistaken." Johnson nodded acceptance. "Tell him he's welcome to rejoin the line for a fresh ration." The crowd dispersed, crisis averted. Jefferson approached Wilson, who still looked upset. "Don't let it get to you," Jefferson advised. "Old prejudices die hard." "But he specifically thought I was trying to poison him," Wilson said. "Not any of the white soldiers." "I know, but look around." Jefferson gestured to the square, where dozens of Germans were accepting food from black soldiers without incident. One old man's fear versus all these people overcoming theirs. "We're winning bit by bit." As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the square lightened. Someone produced an accordion, and music filled the air. Some of the younger Germans began to dance, and soon American soldiers joined in, teaching German girls how to jitterbug while learning traditional Bavarian folk dances in return. Jefferson watched from his distribution table, amazed at the transformation. Less than 48 hours ago, these same townspeople had been barricading themselves in their homes, terrified of the black soldiers. Now they were dancing together in the town square. Helga Müller arrived with her daughters, their place in line coincidentally bringing them to Jefferson's table. Greta recognized him from the baseball game the day before and waved excitedly. "Hallo, Herr Soldat," she called. "Do you know Captain Johnson? He stays in our house." Jefferson smiled. "Yes, I know the captain. He's my commanding officer." Lieutenant Schmidt, who was nearby, translated. Helga looked surprised to learn that the black officer she had feared was this soldier's superior. "Your daughters are beautiful, ma'am," Jefferson said as Schmidt translated. He placed extra chocolates in their ration basket. "The captain has a daughter about their age." "Yes, Lily," Helga replied through Schmidt. "He showed us her picture." She hesitated. I was afraid when I heard Negro soldiers were coming. I believed what we were told." She looked down, embarrassed. "I was wrong." Jefferson nodded acknowledgement. "Many people have wrong ideas about us." "We're used to it." "That doesn't make it right," Helga said. "No, ma'am, it doesn't." As they moved away, Williams nudged Jefferson. "What was that about, Sarge?" "Another mind changed," Jefferson replied. Small victories, Private. Small victories. By late afternoon, the ration distribution was winding down. Most of the food had been given out, and the square had taken on the atmosphere of an impromptu festival. Children played games with American soldiers, women chatted with army nurses, and even some of the older German men had overcome their initial hostility to engage in halting conversations through interpreters. Colonel Bates surveyed the scene with satisfaction. "This is more effective than any denazification program the brass could dream up," he commented to Captain Johnson. "Hard to hate people who feed your children and dance with your daughters." "It won't last without reinforcement," Johnson replied. "We'll move on, and who knows what narratives will replace us." "True," Bates acknowledged, "but some experiences can't be erased. These people will remember this day, and that's a start." Nearby, a phonograph had been set up, playing American jazz records. The syncopated rhythms were alien to most of the Germans, but the younger ones took to it immediately, attempting to mimic the dancing styles of the American soldiers. "Now there's something I never thought I'd see," Jefferson remarked to Washington as they packed up their distribution table. "German girls dancing to Duke Ellington." Washington laughed. Hitler must be spinning in his bunker. A commotion near the phonograph drew their attention. Several elderly Germans were protesting the degenerate music, while younger ones defended it. The argument was becoming heated. Jefferson and Washington exchanged glances, then moved toward the disturbance. Before they could intervene, however, Hans's mother stepped forward. She said something in German that caused both sides to fall silent. Then, to everyone's amazement, she walked up to Williams, who was standing near the phonograph, and extended her hand in invitation. Williams looked stunned, then grinned and accepted her hand. Together they began to dance a simple box step to Ellington's "Take the A Train." The woman was stiff at first, clearly uncomfortable, but gradually relaxed as Williams led her gracefully around the square. Other couples joined them, American soldiers with German girls, older Germans with army nurses. The protest forgotten, the square became a swirl of olive-drab uniforms and civilian clothes, black faces and white, all moving to the same American rhythm. Jefferson felt a tug at his sleeve. Greta stood there looking up at him expectantly. "Tans?" she asked, mimicking a dance step. Jefferson hesitated, then smiled and took her small hand. "Why not? Tans it is." As they danced, Jefferson noticed Helga watching from the sidelines, her expression a mixture of wonder and lingering concern. He gave her a reassuring nod, which she returned after a moment's hesitation. The music shifted to a slower number. Williams was now dancing with an elderly German woman, who was teaching him the steps to a traditional Bavarian waltz. His natural athleticism served him well, and soon they were gliding across the square, the woman beaming with pleasure as the young soldier mastered the unfamiliar dance. "Would you ever have believed this?" Washington asked, joining Jefferson after Greta ran off to find her sister. Jefferson shook his head. "Not in a million years. Yesterday they thought we were cannibals. Today we're dance partners. Makes you wonder what else could change if people just got to know each other," Washington mused. "Don't get your hopes up too high," Jefferson cautioned. "This is a special situation when we go home." "I know," Washington acknowledged, "but I'm going to remember this day. No matter what happens back home, I'll know it's possible for things to be different." As evening approached, the celebration began to wind down. Curfew would soon be in effect, and the Germans began to drift homeward, many stopping to thank the American soldiers with handshakes or small gifts, a homemade cookie, a hand-carved figurine, a pressed flower. Hans and his mother approached Jefferson's table as they were packing up the last of the supplies. "Auf Wiedersehen, Herr William," Hans said solemnly, offering a small wooden carving of a tank. Jefferson accepted it with equal solemnity. "Thank you, Hans, it's very good." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, his unit insignia pin, the Black Panther of the 761st. "Here, something to remember us by." Hans's eyes widened. He took the pin reverently, then threw his arms around Jefferson in an impulsive hug. After a moment's surprise, Jefferson returned it. Hans's mother watched, tears in her eyes. "Danke," she said simply. "Danke." Lieutenant Schmidt, passing by, translated her next words. "She says she was wrong about you. She's sorry for believing the lies. She says Hans will grow up knowing the truth. Jefferson nodded acknowledgement. Tell her that's all any of us can ask for. As the Germans left the square, Colonel Bates approached Jefferson and his crew. Well done, gentlemen. I've received word from the Burgermeister that the town council wants to hold a small ceremony tomorrow before we depart, a token of appreciation for your humanitarian efforts. Sir, Jefferson was confused. What did we do besides hand out army rations? Bates smiled. You treated them like human beings, Sergeant. After years of being told you were something less, you proved yourselves to be something more. He looked around at the now empty square. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is a simple kindness. That night, dinner at the Miller house was a vastly different affair from the tense meal of 2 nights before. Helga had managed to bake a small cake using flour and sugar from the American rations. Captain Johnson and Lieutenant Parker contributed a bottle of wine liberated from a Nazi officer's quarters in a neighboring town. Greta and Elsa joined them at the table, all fear forgotten. They peppered Captain Johnson with questions about America, his daughter Lily, and his life before the war. Johnson answered patiently as Parker translated, clearly enjoying the children's curiosity. Will you come back to visit us after the war, Captain Johnson? Greta asked. Johnson smiled. I'd like that, Greta. Perhaps one day when the world is peaceful again. You could bring Lily, Elsa suggested. We could show her our favorite places. That's a wonderful idea, Johnson replied, though his eyes told a different story. He knew the chances of returning to this small Bavarian town were slim. Helga noticed his expression. You don't think it will happen? Johnson sighed. The world after this war will be complicated. There will be many barriers. Because of your color? Helga asked directly. Partly, Johnson acknowledged, but also politics, borders, the aftermath of war. Germany will have a long road to recovery. As will America in its own way, Parker added unexpectedly. We have our own prejudices to overcome. Johnson gave his fellow officer a surprised look. Lieutenant Parker had never before acknowledged the racial problems in America so directly. It's true, Parker said, meeting Johnson's gaze. What we've seen here, the consequences of hate, of dehumanizing others, it happens in America too. Different context, same disease. Helga looked between them, understanding even without translation. Then we must all do better, she said simply. For the children's sake, if nothing else. Johnson raised his glass. To doing better. They all drank to that. The departure ceremony the next morning was a simple affair. The townspeople gathered in the square as the tanks of the 761st prepared to move out. The Burgermeister made a short speech, thanking the Americans for their humanity and restraint. A local girls' choir sang a traditional German folk song. Then, to everyone's surprise, they segued into the Star-Spangled Banner, phonetically learned overnight as a gesture of respect. Many of the American soldiers, black and white alike, were visibly moved. Colonel Bates accepted a small plaque on behalf of the battalion, promising that it would be displayed proudly at their headquarters. As the ceremony concluded, Jefferson noticed Williams standing apart, looking troubled. "What's on your mind, Private?" Jefferson asked. Williams shook his head. "Just thinking about how crazy this is, Sarge. 3 days ago, these people were terrified of us. Now they're singing our anthem." He gestured at the Germans. "They learned they were wrong about us, but when we go home..." He trailed off. Jefferson understood. "When we go home, nothing will have changed." "Is that what you're thinking?" "Yes, sir. We'll still be second-class citizens. Still have to use the colored facilities, still get treated like we're something less." "Probably," Jefferson agreed, "at least at first. Change takes time." "Does it, though?" Williams challenged. "These folks changed their minds in 3 days." Jefferson considered this. "Maybe. Or maybe they're just grateful we didn't do what they feared we would. The real test would be if we stayed longer, became neighbors instead of just passing through." He put a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "But don't discount what happened here. It matters, and we'll take it with us when we go home." Williams nodded slowly. "I'm going to tell my kids about this someday, about how a whole town of white folks in Germany went from thinking we were monsters to dancing with us in the square." That's the spirit, Jefferson said, and maybe your kids will live in a better world because of what we did here. Maybe, Williams agreed, but he didn't sound convinced. The order came to mount up. The tanks of the 761st began their engines, the rumble echoing across the square. The Germans stood in respectful silence as the column prepared to depart. Jefferson climbed into his turret. From his elevated position, he could see the assembled townspeople. There was Hans with his mother, the boy proudly wearing the Black Panther pin on his jacket. There was Helga Müller with her daughters, standing beside Captain Johnson's temporary quarters. There were the girls who had danced to Duke Ellington, the boys who had learned baseball, the elders who had overcome decades of prejudice in a matter of days. As the lead tanks began to move, something unexpected happened. Hans broke from his mother's side and ran to Jefferson's tank, calling out in German. Jefferson couldn't understand the words, but the boy's intent was clear. He wanted to say goodbye. Jefferson leaned down from the turret, extending his hand. Hans took it, his small hand engulfed in the soldier's larger one. "Auf Wiedersehen, Hans," Jefferson said. "Be good." The boy nodded solemnly. "Auf Wiedersehen, Herr William. Danke." Then Hans did something that caught Jefferson completely by surprise. He placed his other hand over their clasped hands, making a deliberate show of touching the black soldier's skin without fear. A murmur ran through the watching Germans. Then, one by one, others approached the tanks. Children, women, even some of the older men. They reached up to shake hands, to touch shoulders, to make physical contact with the black soldiers they had been warned never to let touch them. Jefferson felt a lump in his throat. It was a simple gesture, yet profound in its rejection of the fear and hatred that had been systematically instilled in these people. They were not just saying goodbye, they were making a statement. As the tanks rolled out of Miesbach, the Germans lined the streets, waving and calling out farewells. Some of the children ran alongside for a while, until the tanks picked up speed on the open road. Jefferson settled into the familiar routine of travel, his thoughts turning to what lay ahead. The war in Europe was effectively over. Soon they would be heading home. What would that homecoming be like? Would America welcome its black heroes, or would they face the same old prejudice, the same old barriers? He thought of Hans, of Helga Müller, of the Germans who had overcome years of indoctrination in a matter of days. If they could change, couldn't America? The answer wasn't simple, but Jefferson found himself hopeful in a way he hadn't been before. Whatever happened next, he and his comrades had made their mark. They had fought with distinction. They had conducted themselves with honor. They had changed minds and hearts in a small Bavarian town. It wasn't world-changing, perhaps, but it was something. As the 761st Tank Battalion rolled toward Austria, leaving Miesbach behind, Staff Sergeant William Jefferson allowed himself a moment of pride. They had proven themselves not just as soldiers, but as men. And in doing so, they had struck a small but meaningful blow against the hatred and division that had caused so much suffering. It wasn't a complete victory. There were many battles still to be fought, many minds still to be changed. But it was a start. And sometimes, Jefferson reflected, a start was all you needed. Years later, in 1965, a middle-aged William Jefferson, now a civil engineer in Chicago, received an unexpected package from Germany. Inside was a faded photograph of a Sherman tank surrounded by smiling German children and a letter written in careful English. "Dear Herr William, you may not remember me, but I was a boy in Miesbach when you came with your tank in 1945. I still have the Black Panther pin you gave me. I became a teacher, and I tell my students every year about the black American soldiers who gave us chocolate and taught us baseball when we expected them to hurt us. I tell them how wrong we were and how kind you were instead. My mother passed away last year, but she never forgot the day she danced with your friend in the square. She said it was the day she began to think for herself again. After years of believing what she was told to believe, there is still much prejudice in the world, but less in our small town because of what you did. My own children have grown up knowing that a person's character has nothing to do with the color of their skin." With respect and gratitude, Hans Weber Jefferson showed the letter to his wife and children that evening. His teenage son, reading it over his shoulder, asked, Did you really change their minds just by being nice to them? Jefferson considered the question. It wasn't that simple, he replied. We showed them that everything they'd been told about us was a lie. Once they realized that, they had to question everything else they'd been taught. He smiled at the memory. And yes, a little kindness went a long way. Chocolate and baseball diplomacy, we called it. Did things change when you came home? His daughter asked, after what you did in the war. Jefferson's smile faded. Not right away. We came back to the same segregation, the same prejudice. Some of us were even attacked for wearing our uniforms in public. He glanced at the newspaper on the coffee table, with its headlines about civil rights demonstrations. But change is coming slowly but surely. Just like in Miesbach, people are learning to question what they've been taught. He picked up Hans's letter again, reading the final lines. Captain Johnson once told my mother that the most revolutionary act is sometimes a simple kindness. I have tried to live by those words. Perhaps if enough of us do, the world will finally change. Jefferson couldn't have agreed more. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.